Hi there. The red carpet premiere of House of the Dragon Season 2 was held this past Monday in New York City. It was a private screening for critics. They had to sign NDAs, but one thing they could talk about was that Season 2 will have a new opening credits animation. Because they reported on it, Ryan Condal himself then talked about it in more detail in an interview with io9.com. This is good news. I didn't really like the credits they had in Season 1. The Season 1 title animation was supposed to be it's Viserys' models of old Valyria expanding out like clockwork while blood drips through it in a line, and this line of blood branching and forking. It's literally showing the Targaryen bloodline, and it updates throughout Season 1's time skips as new children are born, as there's new marriages. And I get that. That's pretty much what everyone's reaction was. I get this on paper, but yeah, I'm not feeling it. I was never fond of it. I'm glad they're changing it. I have never seen anyone who was really hyped about it. Why don't I like it? Two very clear reasons. This is pretty obvious. First, the entire reason that Game of Thrones opening animation of an astrolabe map was such a good idea is that it was informative to people who had not read the books. That it's clearly showing a map and major locations that the narrative is going to in that episode. In contrast, the Bloodlines in House of the Dragon Season 1 weren't actually labeled with character names. There were symbols for some of the characters, a few more obvious than others. I mean, obviously, like, you have bugs associated with Helena or something, but that isn't informative. And I think it was the unfortunate result of mishmashing a few ideas from the Game of Thrones opening credits the wrong way. Because while this map is expanding, as they show the actors' names, they all had little symbols next to them, like Varys is called the Spider, so Conleth Hill had a little spider sigil next to his name. Everyone had a little custom name. Natalie Emanuel had a butterfly because Missandei is from Nath, which is famous for its butterflies. Some were like in-jokes for the actors, but those were meant to be Easter eggs. They weren't that easy to see. You had to zoom in on them, and that was fine. They weren't the focus of the opening credits. The focus was the map. And it's like they took that idea and put them in as the bloodline is forking. There is no way you can claim this thing was informative. Even the hardcore book channels, me, other major ones, we had to spend time looking up what the updates were in the Season 1 opening credits. So it wasn't informative to us. It wasn't never going to be informative to people who hadn't read the books. That's just the wrong way to mash these ideas together. And I said there were two reasons. The second is it's simply hard to see. Even taking as a given that, okay, it's a bloodline and that we're not bothering to label it with names, because we can't, it's just symbols. It is dark because it's blood against gray stone. And the camera is zipping around too much, moving through and around this complicated castle piece, that even if you were trying to follow the bloodline, it's doing too many things. So it took what kind of worked in the Game of Thrones opening credits, that, like, Winterfell unravels as if it's in a cuckoo clock, like in an astrolabe. It's designed. They said it's mechanisms like in that kind of machinery. Yeah, but it showed that unfurling in wide shot. It didn't have a camera zooming through the streets of King's Landing being... The word I'm looking for is disorienting. It was very disorienting. It would have been disorienting even if they had labeled the names clearly. It's like, I get the idea on paper. There were still better ways to do this. And I don't think it really... I think the worst part was doing it in the model of Valyria. That isn't really that important to anything. I mean, if you were really invested in, we need to show the bloodline, we need to show the family tree, show an illuminated manuscript unfurling and being written out, and even have, like, someone stabbed so there's blood trickling on the illuminated manuscript or whatever, the way it flows like that, but have it flow past names written out in text, like spell out Helena Targaryen, that it was weird when you'd see like Screen Rant or New Rock Stars, and they'd be so excited. Here's our breakdown of the opening credits. It's that this is an Easter egg breakdown for what should have been a clear, informative element for new viewers. So I get what they were trying to do on paper, and I was just never happy with it. I'm glad they're changing it. So what are they replacing it with? Unfortunately, they're not going back to the astrolabe map. I wish they would. I realize why they don't, because they're not going to quite as many places, even in Season 2. I mean, Season 1, it's mostly King's Landing, Dragonstone, and Driftmark with one or two side steps. Even Season 2, it doesn't really justify that. They never go to the Eastern Continent, or rarely for the Triarchy, or maybe the Stepstones. It's focused enough geographically, this wasn't really worth it. I do miss it, though, and I hope they bring it back for some other thing, you never know. But instead, it has been described, and Ryan Condal himself has described, because he gave a new interview about it, as we see a historical tapestry being woven, depicting the story of the Dance of the Dragons. A tapestry like the Bayeux Tapestry, showing the Norman Conquest. I've actually seen the Bayeux Tapestry in person. I went when I was on a trip to France a couple of years ago, and actually like 10 years ago, and it was fun because I was taking Latin class at the time, and there's simplistic Latin in it. It's not like a paragraph. It's like the bishop blesses the bread. The ships leave the harbor. See spot run. It's simple sentences, so I could read it reasonably well. And it's just, and my family's like, wow, you can read, and just, well, yeah, they're simple sentences, but I've seen the Bayeux Tapestry in person. It's really good. So it's like the Bayeux Tapestry, like it's showing the Norman conquest of England or something. They're showing the Dance of the Dragons as this big historical event, looking back on it centuries later. I mean, the idea is that everyone in the Dance of the Dragons, these are historical figures to people in the main Game of Thrones time frame, almost 200 years later. So it's not just that this happened in the aftermath of the dance. This is something being made in, like, the reign of King Robert Baratheon, is the idea of when the tapestry you're seeing in the animation is being made. That imagine what it's like being in a society that doesn't have television or photographs or even consistent newspapers. That we remember historical events through artwork and song, rarely handwritten parchment manuscripts, but that's really it. So everything is stylized, that this is how the story came down to, and was distorted a little bit, how the story came down to Ned Stark and Jaime Lannister's generation. That they look back on them as figures from history, and you see bits of that even in the fifth novel. There's a point when Jaime is reading about Criston Cole as another Kingsguard, and is reflecting on it and wondering what the real person was like, because all they have are the archetypes that came down, and the rival historians. So this is a really good idea, and anything would be better than what they did in Season 1. Well, Season 1 was serviceable, but this is a lot better of an idea. And in his interview, Ryan Condal said that the tapestry will start at the Doom of Valyria, and it ends, in the Season 2 premiere at least, it ends with Vhagar killing Arrax over Storm's End, which was the Season 1 finale leading into the Season 2 premiere, though he said it will update as the narrative expands and continues to show other events. I'm not sure if it'll expand episode by episode, or like the Game of Thrones credits would expand as story things happen, like you see Winterfell being burned, that kind of thing. And if you think about it, that's very similar to what the Game of Thrones astrolabe did as well. It starts with the Doom of Valyria. If you notice that the sides of the astrolabe are lined with artwork, like etched into the metal. And it's not the main focus. The main focus is the map, but it starts with this explosion of the Doom of Valyria. Then you see heraldry symbolizing the great houses as animals fighting each other. You see the dragon forcing all the other animals to submit, but then the stag, the Baratheon stag, overthrows the dragon, and then all of the other animals of the forest bow to the stag. The Stark direwolf, the Lannister lion are bowing to the Baratheon stag at the beginning of Season 1. And that was always just in there. So yeah, it's a big historical event to ground the world. And it makes even more sense for a show about the Targaryens to start with Valyria. So I am really looking forward to this. I'm unsure of exactly what it'll look like, but they said it will be like this tapestry being filled in the style of the Bayou Tapestry. I'm really excited about this. Some other details here and there, just as an outro. Fun details about the Game of Thrones astrolabe, and this makes sense in context of why it wouldn't really work for House of the Dragon. They had a rule in place since the beginning that 3 locations always had to appear: King's Landing, the Wall, and wherever Daenerys is now on the Eastern Continent. I saw an interview with the animator who designed the whole thing. He said that, quote, wherever Daenerys is. But the point is, she's in an entirely different continent. So first Pentos, then Vaes Dothrak, a lot of it Marine. And they put this rule in place to emphasize how big the world is. Like, even if there was an episode where, like, almost all of it was King's Landing or something, you need to show how big the world is. And when I say this was always in place, even if there were some episodes Jon Snow didn't appear in, there were a few episodes Daenerys doesn't appear in. So even if this was an off episode for the Wall storyline or the Essos storyline, they still needed to show it, so they could impress viewers with how big the world is, even if the narrative was relatively contained for whatever reason. It was mostly like Tyrion's trial or something. Well, that was the first big rule, that these 3 locations always need to appear. But there were 2 other rules which were more practical. The second rule was just, if a location doesn't appear frequently enough to justify making it, we shouldn't. Like Braavos. Braavos, a lot of Arya's storyline takes place there in seasons 5 and 6. They get a lot of reuse out of it. So it justified the cost and expense of, CGI designing Braavos. In contrast, Volantis appeared in exactly 1 episode. So it didn't justify making a Volantis model. The third rule is the time limitation, that, all of this animation has to fit within the finite predetermined length of the opening credits and theme song. And on top of that, there's, even if you cycled through them really quickly, they can't zip the camera around too fast. That would look silly. Like, going straight from Pike to Marine is too confusing when you pan and zoom like that. So taking into account there's a limited amount of time, and they don't even want the camera moving that fast if there's really separate storylines. You could kind of squeeze it in a little more if they're relatively near each other. Point is, just logical extension. The Game of Thrones opening credits never had more than 6 locations in them. And I don't know this off the top of my head. I know this from that the Game of Thrones wiki has an article on the opening title credits, and fans filled it in 1 episode at a time. I didn't work on this a lot, just people had a checklist of what appeared this week and was filled in 1 week at a time for a decade of, hey, what's in here not? And I read a good interview and filled it in there of them explaining why do certain things appear and others don't. So they have to have those 3 locations. They never had more than 6. Winterfell was usually the 4th location, simply because if you have to show King's Landing, you have to show the Wall. The Winterfell is in between. You can usually fit that in. Even when Winterfell wasn't in an episode, there was a large portion of time where they weren't in Winterfell, like season 4-ish. So they would skip it then, but generally that's what you're looking at. So there were places that we wished had locations, others didn't. But in terms of what this reflects is using the astrolabe is to show the full scale of the world. And there's a rule in place that you need to show the Wall and you need to show Essos. When, even though we know Season 2 is going to briefly show the Wall and briefly go to Tyrosh, it's never going to Marine again or Karth or something, that it isn't really worth pulling out the astrolabe map again for something that will never go directly to Dorne or the Iron Islands, rarely go to the north. Most of the story is in the Crownlands, the Riverlands, and the Reach, with a few outliers, that it's not diverse enough to justify doing that. I think they should have done a map, but in an entirely different style. Like a hand-drawn map, that if they're showing a tapestry, change that to an illuminated manuscript map. That's actually what they were originally going to do before they came up with the astrolabe. The original plan was have it would have started with a crow flying over a map, and then like Indiana Jones style would have had the camera moving around the map to show these are places we're going this episode, which is a decent enough idea, but they improved on that. So that's how the opening credits work. And it's like, oh, you're praising the opening credits so much. It's Benioff and Weiss don't make everything in the show. I am praising the special effects artist who came up with this as an idea. Like, they didn't come up with the music, even though they've directly said, well, you should praise us for the music because we had the sense to hire Ramin Javadi, so you're really praising me. No. You do not get to take credit for the hard-working people who suffered under you. And that ties into another point that, let me be very clear. They did specify this. The animation is changing. The theme song will remain the same. Which is good. The Game of Thrones fanfare composed by Ramin Javadi is iconic. And I loved it that House of the Dragon kept using it, because if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And it helped emphasize, I've said this before, this didn't belong to Benioff and Weiss. This was something brilliant Javadi came up with, that even when Benioff and Weiss are gone, that it will stop being directly associated with just those two guys, but with the world of Westeros when they're gone. Not as a legacy of them, but we succeeded in spite of you, not because of you. That I don't want that, like, the Targaryens are no longer synonymous with Benioff and Weiss. That how Condal is handling them is a lot better. So I like that they reuse the music because it's good and because it helps wash away the stain of the other guys from its legacy. And they are going to roll it over this new animation of a tapestry, historical tapestry.